University of San Francisco. And as the short person, I'll try to see you all from behind the podium. You can give me the timing, right? Yes, I let go slightly over 20 minutes. Hi everyone, thank you for coming. The title of my talk is The Roots of Contingency Documenting the Arboreal. One of the most persistent anecdotes in film history relates to the surprising impression left on early spectators by an unlikely actor, trees. During the first exhibitions of the Lumiere actuality, Le Repas de Bébé, Baby's First Meal, audiences were reportedly more interested in background details like the distant trees and trembling leaves blowing in the wind than the main attraction. James Laster speculates that what people had found enthralling in that image was the contrast between the staged and the unstaged. So the carefully choreographed interactions of a family having breakfast in the foreground and the physical world's obliviousness to that narrative in the background, right? Displayed in the interplay between the two planes were essentially modernity's contradictions, its tendency to rationalize or choreograph every aspect of life, while also promoting the contingent or the spontaneous as a site of wonder. Alongside signaling a modernist sensibility, the wind in the tree later became one of the foundational narratives in cinematic realism, as it came to be associated with the idea of nature caught in the act. However, it has been argued by several film scholars that attributing early cinema's fascination with incidentals like trees merely to a modernist or realist impulse is reductive. For example, Marianne Doan highlights that the windswept trees in the Lumiere film appealed not only to realists, but filmmakers like Georges Méliès, who celebrated for pioneering special effects cinema. To him, the image of the swaying trees offered a harnessing of spontaneity, unpredictability, and the loss of control, the effect of which could be achieved by staged tricks as well. Turning to yet another influential figure, Krakauer, Janet Harbert argues that German theorists located in the images of natural elements evidence to the ability of film to work unexpectedly on the senses, which gave the contingent a bodily or application. Krakauer was closer to an expressive or surrealist aesthetic than a realist or modernist one in its attention to the sensuous. In this paper, I offer a third approach, thinking about the relationship between cinema, incidentals, and contingency through the lens of arboreal humanities. More specifically, I use the wind and the tree debate as an entry point to tracing the lineage and affordances of an arboreal thinking in cinema, which has only intensified in the era of climate change. What caused such an intensification is the rising awareness of the importance of arboreal and mycorrhizal networks to sustaining ecosystems. I don't know if you're familiar, but mycorrhizal network is an underground network found in forests and other plant communities created by fungi joining with plant or tree roots, right? They're basically the internet of the plant world, the Wood Wide Web. And so there's a lot of interest in recent years on that. So we have that in the past decade, we have seen a dramatic increase in the number of films engaging with trees, not as incidental details in their backdrops, but as their primary interests in this regard. And Underground Astronaut is an example of that. It is dedicated to the mycorrhizal, but you can see like the scientist is trying to listen to the trees, right, the roots of the trees. These films draw upon advances in climate science and a wide range of cinematic techniques to represent the world in peril, while foraying into new areas of research such as tree perception, cognition, and communication. In doing so, they establish a framework for understanding human-nature relationships through the materiality and temporality of the arboreal. In what follows, I will talk about a few examples and look at how films, or these films on trees, push cinema toward what Richard Grusin calls arboreal mediation. Richard Grusin doesn't provide a clear-cut or short definition for the concept because he talks about tree mediation, radical mediation, and arboreal mediation altogether. But he suggests that arboreal mediation involves entering into technical, bodily, and material relations with the world based on contiguity, rather than representation, mimesis, or metaphor. So contiguity, kind of the way the trees interact with the world, right? Bordering, reaching out, coming into contact with the human and non-human world in connected ways. His use of the word contiguity is striking to me in that it stems from the same etymological root as contingence, contingere, right? And that has to do with touch. This is the vocabulary, the commonest definition, right? The attribute of being so near as to be touching. What happens when we think of cinema in this manner, right? And touching with cinema or arboreal cinema. Oliver Lax's docufiction film, The Fire Will Come, or O Que Hable, offers provocative elements for contemplation. Winner of the jury prize at Cannes Film Festival in 2019, the film features three stylistically distinct acts. It shows you the creativity of the new Galician cinema movement, which Oliver Lax is part of. Novo Cinema Galego is marked by the distinct non-fiction style of the graduates from the creative documentary program of Universitat de Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. So the opening sequence, short but highly stylized, evokes an eco-horror aesthetic. It depicts the destruction of a forest of eucalyptus trees by bulldozers in a remote part of rural Spain in the middle of the night. Should we turn up the light so you can see better? I'm not sure, but yeah, let's do that. Okay. I mean, you missed the sensual part of the trees, but yes. I mean, it starts with actually close-ups and then goes into this kind of broader view of the forest and trees being cut. And it really kind of did. You can't. I didn't include the sound, but the eerie sound mix and visceral close-ups of the trees, which we understand to be invasive later on, make the destruction appear ominous and nightmarish. The body of the film, following the sequence, is shot in a conventional cinematic realism tone. So this is what it looks like. It provides little contextualization for what came before. Instead, it introduces a docufiction story that of the protagonist Amador, a former forest warden and arsonist, who has recently been released from prison and makes a quiet return to his sparsely populated village. By following the slow and uneventful life of Amador and of the locals, who are all non-professional actors playing characters named after themselves, the viewer gets a glimpse into the declining socioeconomic and ecological conditions in the Galician countryside, frequently ravaged by forest fires. The calm and quiet get disrupted again in the final third of the film when a fire breaks out and the locals project their anger and frustration onto Amador, although there is no evidence that he started the fire in either of the cases. This segment is also haunting in that it features documentary footage from a real forest fire, which reportedly the director waited for to film. And he trained with the firefighters, and when the fire broke out, he started filming. As fire engulfs the forest and real firefighters fight relentlessly to stop its advance, the film's reference suddenly changes. An epistemological uncertainty takes hold, and it is no longer clear whether we are watching fiction or non-fiction, man-made fire or natural disaster disguised as man-made, or man-made disaster disguised as natural. This last form of uncertainty is the most intriguing to me, as it instantly makes climate change the film's real reference, which the fictional story in the foreground becomes incidental to. In other words, the switch to the real forest fire has a rack focus effect, shifting foreground-background relations. While this film and the linear actuality seem worlds apart, the close encounters with the tree kind in them seem to leave similar affective impressions, a sense of almost touching nearness or contiguity to nature, right, which becomes the real story. Modernist film theory is not good at explaining what's happening here, in my opinion. Contingent events like a forest fire in the climate change era, right, the forest fires that are out of control, no longer mark forces independent from human causality. So we can't exactly call them unstaged. According to the Anthropocene scientists, all contingencies are to be understood nowadays as caused by human activities, which we can think of as the ultimate staging. Realist film theory's notion of nature caught in the act also doesn't apply for similar reasons. This is where arboreal mediation comes in. It configures contiguity as contingency, or as an in-the-middleness of things, or relationality. In documentaries like Trees and Other Entanglements, we see a direct engagement with such an understanding. As the use of the word entanglements in the title suggests, the film directly reflects a post-climate change environmental sensibility, drawing attention to the intertwined lives of humans and trees in a destabilized world. And the web of relations it presents is quite complex too. Art, science, colonial, extractive, and racialized histories all come into play in the film. However, the film also demonstrates that a focus on relationality requires attention to the question of scale. Once you bring in the arboreal or arboreal thought or engagements with trees into cinema, you have to think about scale shifting. Trees are difficult to represent in terms of their size, underground networks, and relation to temporality, with some trees' lifespans spanning across millennia. The film constantly introduces new aesthetic devices to show the audience how trees outscale us in these aspects. We see a blend of scientific realism, cinematic realism, first-person accounts, archival footage, animation, data visualization, and experimental photography, for example. Giants Rising, a documentary about California's coastal redwood forests, also has a similar approach, adding projection mapping to the mix. The team that created the animation sequences of the film says this about the challenge of representation when it comes to the colossal redwoods on their website. Perhaps you might think it's easy to document a tree. After all, it's not like you're filming an elusive wild cat on some hard-to-reach mountaintop. These majestic giants stand there year after year and seemingly to our eyes grow very, very slowly, but that is so far from the truth. And understanding their culture is not that easy. To begin with, a large part of the tree is underground, and the part above ground is so tall it's impossible to see in its entirety. Another strange phenomenon is that it's almost impossible to tell where one tree ends and another tree begins. And to this, their unique ability to communicate and collaborate, redwoods even create their own weather patterns, like the fog in Santa Cruz. Now that I moved there, I can, yes, I'm witness to this. The question of scale is important in the discussions of how to represent climate change and Anthropocene too. Imagining the ecological crisis at a planetary scale and taking into account the deep time of Earth systems requires constant scale shifting. Therefore, I find the creative liberty that these films take in incorporating different aesthetic strategies, devices, and media evocative. In my remaining time, I can give you examples to what some of these films do in terms of techniques, and I'm trying to map them in terms of, again, what they suggest about maybe arboreal mediation. So first common technique is the extreme long shot. This shows the full canopy of the tree from a distance, and we often see kind of a common variation of this, right? Like we often see shots that show human subjects dwarfed by trees that they stare up in awe at. The two posters that I showed you previously also have that shot, right? They're all like looking up. It's kind of evocative of the, I think, arboreal sublime. That's what it makes me think of. The second technique I'm interested in is the vertical scan, where the filmmaker tries to track kind of like a tree from top to bottom or bottom to top. The experimental short film, The Great Tree Piece, we see a single tracking shot from the crown of an apricot tree to the underground, where humus, fungi, and roots are shown as part of trees' life world. The film is named in reference to Albrecht Dürer's painting, The Great Piece of Turf, which is an early study of ecosystemic view of nature, right? And it's a view of nature that outgrows itself. In The Great Tree Piece, the shapes are multiplied by AI, and it's very slow, so maybe I'll just try to fast forward a little bit so you can see the AI bits. Until a fantastic chiaroscuro landscape emerges, revealing the materiality of the tree. When macro images of a bumblebee, okay, let's get to the bumblebee if we can. Okay. When macro images of a bumblebee delve all the way into the individual cells, the film turns into a metamorphosing animation featuring red light fluids and minuscule pulsing forms. In other words, in one tracking shot, the film takes a vertical plunge from realism into speculative fabulation about arboreal life worlds. And I'll just
show you some like later images. It kind of ends like this. It's very abstract toward the end. An interesting variation of the vertical shot is the horizontal vertical shot. And this is the example is the Eya Lisa Achtila's work, horizontal. It kind of segments the tree, so right, like in vertical segments. And then it also like tips it horizontally. The next technique is 360-degree scan. I see this in multiple films too. So they try to go around the tree, right? One way you can look at trees, you can try to look at them from a distance, or you can try to go around. It's like a cinematic equivalent of tree hugging, I think. An example of this can be found in Despair of the Monkeys. The film presents the history of the now endangered Araucaria tree and its legacy as a symbol of aesthetic and botanical conquest. It traces the journey of the tree between the filmmaker's home, Patagonia. So it's a Patagonian native tree, but it is really hard to find in its native region nowadays because the colonizers apparently kind of got rid of the trees to plant in faster growing trees for logging. So now they're kind of confined to high altitudes in Patagonia, whereas the filmmaker lives in Belgium and sees them everywhere. Apparently the colonizers brought them to Belgium as ornaments, as bourgeois fashion. Twice in the film, we see a 360-degree scan of the trees. The first is shot with a handheld camera. Imagery cuts to black and white analog footage when a hand picks a branch. And let me see, I can't see the timing, but it's somewhere around here. So when it cuts, like we cut to analog imagery. And then we see a 3D underground trip to America made with data of tree roots. And then excerpts from colonial films shot years after the conquest of Patagonia, imagery from a confocal microscope, only to come back to the 360-degree shot of the rotunda in the end. So this is where you have the cut. And the cut makes media history and plant history converge. So the second 360-degree shot brings me to the next strategy I want to mention, speculative imagery. This time the footage is digitized and to create a point cloud, which then is used to gesture toward a speculative arboreal feature. When I talked to the filmmaker, he said that the technique helps him imagine the trees that survived in high altitudes descend and take possession of the city again. It's almost like an indigenous futurism, right? Like we see the same shot, this time digitized, and then we kind of distance ourselves, it becomes more and more abstract, and it becomes this kind of very speculative, indigenous futuristic image. Of course, like documentary works that use animation, AI, and VR frequently feature speculative approaches too, right? We can think of 3D VR. Last strategy is found footage. There's quite a few films that take up this approach, right? They try to dip the film in teas that are made from tree parts. The experimental short Jacaranda uses blossoms from the picturesque Jacaranda tree to make the materiality of the tree coincide with the medium. And if you don't know what these trees look like, you can just look outside. There are Jacaranda trees lining the main lawn. It gives the film a nice lavender kind of tint, right? Like it is evocative of the tree's own materiality. And if you go to the website of the film, the filmmaker kind of explains, right? I stole some blossoms and made a strong smelling tea, added vitamin C and washing soda, a perfect developer for black and white films. Right? Another film that kind of uses this, it's not found foliage exactly, but it tries to still make the materiality of the tree kind of blend into the fabric of the image. Is again, trees and other entanglements has a sequence. There's a photographer that takes photos of trees, and do I have time? Can I show this clip? This is the last thing, so okay, I can stop after.
Yes.
Okay, I'll just show it just because it's kind of beautiful.
Some of the
the trees I photographed have been as much as 4,000 years old. I wanted to use a process that would reflect this kind of age and this kind of aesthetic. With platinum printing, the metals are very fine and they embed themselves into the paper. The tree will be living within the fibers of the paper so they become one.
Yeah, so the idea is that possibly these images can also live thousands of years, just like the trees. So I'll stop here, but I hope that the range and creativity of the films I showed give you an idea of maybe the potential of arboreal mediation. I hope we can talk more about it today. Thank you.
I also hope we can talk more about it. Very interesting. I'm going to unplug your laptop.
Yes.
Go there, and we're back to our Zoom.